Breathe. Okay, we try that. Chord. So welcome again, and so as noting, once we're done in here, we're going to move to our research and exhibition gallery, which is just right across the hallway to see some of the collections, related collections there. We do have a couple also related collections just on the table over to the side as well. So thank you again for coming. I'm excited to have Rebecca Edwards here today. Rebecca received one of our Weston Kate fellowships for some of the research that is informing this talk, and I just want to make sure everybody knows Weston Kate fellowships are given every other year. So this is one of the years where we're accepting applications for research related to Vermont history. So go to our website, vermonthistory.org, for more information on the Kate Fellowship and how it may help researchers. So excited to have Rebecca again here today. She's a professor of history at the Rochester Institute of Technology, scholar of American Deaf history. Latest book, written with Eric C. Nystrom, is Ordinary Lives, Recovering Deaf Social History Through the American Census. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much to all of you for coming here. It's so exciting to see so many people here today. I'm going to let our interpreters interpret. So stop. Before I start, I wanted to make sure that I told everybody here that I'm building here actually on the research of Betty Ann Morse, who I gratefully acknowledge for her work on particularly Marietta Tyke, who is one of the deaf people I will be talking about today. And she published her work back in 2014, 2015. And I'm just sorry it took so long to follow up, but I so appreciate it. I want to make sure everybody was aware of that. So today, as indicated, I'm here to talk about the work that I started here with the support of the fellowship. And that began with what I thought was a pretty simple idea. That is, how do we put deaf people back into their own history as actors? As we're all guilty of it in the field, myself included. When I have written, we talk about the 19th century deaf community or students at schools for the deaf during the 19th century. But the only people whose names get mentioned typically are teachers in those schools, the principals of those schools, and most of the time, those are all hearing people. So they're, of course, active in these deaf spaces, but they're not deaf people. Whereas the deaf people get to be the deaf students or the deaf community. And that was getting really frustrating to me. Deaf people have to be in their own history, not just as like a group, but the actual people. So I thought, as I often do, I don't know why I think this. I thought, well, how hard can it be? To do that. I should stop saying things like that. So what sparked this project was I looked at the membership list for the New England Gallaudet Association. And the New England Gallaudet Association was the first deaf organization founded in US history. So it's absolutely foundational to the creation of deaf community and the United States, not just in New England. But sadly, most of the records of the New England Gallaudet Association burned in fire in the 1890s. Archivists, take a moment. We all shudder. It's everybody's worst case scenario. So what I'm working off of is one membership list that was published. So it survived the fire. And that list was published in 1857. And it's the membership list as it stood the previous year in 1856, and then it got published. The organization was only founded in 1854. So proving it's better to be lucky than good, we have at least retained the names of some of the earliest people who joined that organization. They are people I started referring to in my head and then in this fellowship application as Vermont's deaf founding mothers and fathers. Right? These are the people who first answered the call, basically, to deaf public deaf community. And so we're going to found the organization, and they said we are all in. Right. So it turns out 20 people from Vermont joined the organization. So the fellowship was about trying to find out as much as I could about those 20 people and create little mini biographies. That went better for some people than for other people. It's really hard to track down ordinary people in historical records, as I'm sure a lot of people who've ever tried to do genealogy in this room have discovered. But I did the best that I could with that. Then I tried to work the problem from the other way to see if any surviving records of the New England Gallaudet Association could offer me any help. And that proved quite interesting. Whereas all the 19th century records, as I said, destroyed in fire, 20th century records told us this story. In 1963, the New England Gallaudet Association looked back on its own history and wrote the following in its bulletin. Over 100 years ago, the New England Gallaudet Association was founded by a small group of deaf people in Vermont. And I thought, it was? Hold on, because the standard story that historians tell, in which I would include myself, I have told and published this story myself. The standard story historians tell is that the New England Gallaudet Association was founded in New Hampshire. So take that. So right away I thought, okay, what this have I gotten myself into? Then they went further and said this. On the invitation of a Vermont group, deaf people from all over New England met at Montpelier, Vermont, February 22nd and 23rd, 1853, for a social meeting. At this affair, Mr. George M. Lucas brought up the idea of forming a society for all the deaf people of all New England. And I thought to myself, who is George M. Lucas and why am I just learning this name for the first time ever? That was not a name that I knew. It is not a name that is celebrated in deaf history books. The most prominent name associated with the founding of the New England Gallaudet Association is a deaf man from New Hampshire, Thomas Brown, who served as the first president of the association, rightly famous, but understandably so. But that's who we talk of as historians. That's not who the New England Gallaudet Association was talking of, right? They're here to give all the credit in the world to George M. Lucas of Vermont. And I thought, okay, we have some work to do. I guess by me, I meant me. As a particular deaf historian, we thought, let's see if we can untangle this. So in the course of looking for, as I said, these 20 deaf Vermonters who joined the New England Gallaudet Association, I also knew I was unraveling the story of how George Lucas brought them all together in the first place. And so that is a bit of the story that I want to share with everybody here today, if that's okay. Right. First, I'd like to introduce a couple. We can't do all 20 of the deaf people I was looking into. We don't have that much time. But I did want to point to a couple of people, both as good examples of the sorts of deaf people who answered the call in the 19th century, and to share where I hope the public might be able to help us as historians out here. So this is pure self-interest on my part. So the two folks to talk about here. One is James Meacham, who attended the American School for the Deaf in the 1840s. He will go on to marry another deaf Vermonter, and they will end up settling back here in Vermont together. They had a deaf son together here in the 1860s. That's somebody who goes to the American School following in the footsteps of his parents. But importantly, James Meacham was a cabinet maker here in Vermont in the 1850s, and he is mentioned in Charles Robinson's, of course, famous book, Vermont Cabinet Makers before 1855. The biographical entry in Robinson's book, however, makes no mention of the fact that Meacham was deaf. So it demonstrates to me the ways that I knew he was a deaf man because he had joined the NHEA and his name was on the list. And so I was searching after him. I know that he's deaf. I know this is the same Meacham because the dates line up and the timeline is correct. But this other source doesn't tell us that he was deaf. And so that is my plea that this is how this work can be difficult because we might be looking right at the deaf person, but not know. And we miss their history because we didn't know. Also, if anyone has ever seen a surviving piece of his cabinetry, you must contact me. I've been looking for 3 years now. But so need on the Meacham family, let me know. Okay. Similar story, Diane Miles. Diane Miles, also from Vermont, also went to the American School for the Deaf, comes back and settles in Vermont, has a quite interesting story. The American School was keeping tabs on its alumni in the 19th century and just recording little facts that came back to them. Where is so-and-so living? So-and-so got married. Imagine it as like the world's slowest moving Facebook page, right? They're just writing the notations in one after another, but they're fascinating if you read through enough of them. In 1849, one of the little entries that suddenly uploaded in this was about Diane. And this is what the school wrote. Knapp sustains a good character, has some property. Though unmarried, she has a son, 7 years old. This happened under circumstances which greatly mitigated her crime, so that she has long since been forgiven by the church, of which she is, I believe, a consistent member. Yeah, spill the tea, American School. I had no idea what the backstory was. I never figured it out. I find nothing from her point of view in the records. Her son is all over the place. Like, yeah, there's a birth certificate. Who is the father? Name not listed. Whatever the story was, Diane was not telling us. She supported herself and her son as a seamstress, and her sewing talents were remarked upon publicly and in the press. In 1876, she exhibited bed quilts at the Windham County Fair as part of a larger display of fair household goods. But the fair's organizing committee drew particular attention to another of her items when they wrote about the success of the 1876 fair. And here's what they said. An old sampler wrought in 1820 by Miss Diana Miles at the age of 13 deserves an honorable mention, as the time and patience required to perform the work must be fully equal to that required for the execution of fancy needlework in these modern days. Again, right? It's exciting to find this source, but also it killed me a little bit, right? This was a sampler created by her in 1820 that still survived in 1876, right? It's on display. Where did it go? Like, how could it be that you saved it for 50 years and then stop saving it? What happened to that sample? Again, people who are in the quilting community, reach out if you find anything that old with the initials DM. I feel like there's bits of a deaf history all around us, right? If we knew who the people were and knew what we were looking for, right? So I'm throwing that out as a plea for help for all of us to keep our eyes open so that we can build a deaf community history together. And finally, for the people in the room, the objects that I have, and thank you, Tony, library pull here are over on the bench. You can look at on the side as we leave. These are pieces of paper objects with the manual alphabet printed on them that used to be sold by Charles Parker, who was a deaf peddler. And so he'd go door to door and sell small items. Some of these were household items, but the ones you'll see here were deaf related. He's selling, there's 3 copies up there. He's selling these images of the manual alphabet so people can read or spell. That, all to say that he also claimed he invented that alphabet. He did not invent that alphabet. Just letting people know. But if you run into it in the press at the time, we'll see him making that claim. He learned that alphabet, as most deaf Americans did at the time, by attending schools for the deaf, going to, in his case, also the American School for the Deaf. So if this is our cohort, what do they do? Right? These are a few members I've been able to introduce you to, but what is their larger impact on building deaf community in the United States in the 19th century? So I want to talk about a couple of events that these folks would have attended together. Right? And so the first is the Grand Reunion, so-called. So the Grand Reunion was held in September of 1850, and it was held on the grounds of the American School for the Deaf in Hartford, Connecticut. The event was pitched as an opportunity for the deaf community to show gratitude to the 2 co-founders of the American School for the Deaf, whom they understood as having literally brought the deaf community into existence. Right? Because for most deaf people in the 19th century, they're growing up scattered across New England. Most deaf people, actually, this is true now. I'm going to say most deaf people then, but that's not quite accurate. Most deaf people then and now have hearing parents. Right? It's estimated that only 10% of deaf people have deaf parents. So most deaf people, by definition, grow up in hearing families. Right? So that also means they are not learning sign language in those spaces. They're not learning to communicate directly with their hearing family in those spaces. And they are probably not meeting many other deaf people in those spaces either. Right? So in the 19th century, that meant you had a lot of isolated deaf people across New England who some of them thought they were the only deaf person. Right? Because they had never met another deaf person in their town. That extreme level of isolation is less likely to happen today because technology, right? Most deaf people who are growing up now are aware of the fact that other deaf people exist, right? But if you had seriously never met another deaf person in your small New England town, how would you know that? And why would you guess that? Based upon all the available data so far, you are one of one. Right. So many deaf people who came to the American School for the Deaf in Hartford especially the first half of the 19th century, it was shocking. Right. Suddenly I'm meeting a lot of other deaf people and all these people are like me. Right. And it's that kind of shock of recognition that we share the same physicality, how we move through the world, that later moves deaf people, and particularly these deaf people I was talking about today, to come together into community with one another. And of course, they are empowered to do that by the education that they've received, which has made them bilingual, both in English and in American Sign Language. American Sign Language, the language that they created together in those spaces in 19th century deaf communities, and the language that binds their experience of being deaf to one another. So this grand reunion in 1850 is meant to celebrate the hearing and deaf founders of the American School who made all of that happen in their lives. Where the American School for the Deaf was founded in 1817, it was founded by a hearing man, an American named Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, and it was co-founded with his partner, Laurent Claire, who's a deaf Frenchman who moved here to help with the work of opening the school. I should add, the original plan for him to open the school was that he would come to America for 3 years. That was the contract that he had agreed to come help with. And then, predictably, he never left. He never went home to France. He lived here the rest of his life. So this reunion event, this grand reunion, was called for by Thomas Brown, predictably, because he was the big leader of the deaf community at the time, and he says we have to come together to show our gratitude to this pair. Each man was presented at the event with an ornate silver pitcher and a matching tray that it sat on. Quite recently, like by quite recently, I mean this fall, I found a new artifact which had been donated to the American School for the Deaf. It was a donor list of all of the people who had donated money to help to buy Laurent Claire's picture. If anyone has a lead on the deaf people who donated to buy the Gallaudet silver, contact me immediately. This list was only for those who had donated to the Claire cause. And several deaf Vermonters are on that list, including James Meacham, cabinet maker, and George M. Lucas, who it turns out was the whole reason we got a New England Gallaudet Association in the first place. In all, 208 alumni came back for this event in 1850. And that 1850 event proved to be an absolute watershed for deaf community history. As one researcher has explained, the ceremony was widely attended, widely reported. It put on public display not just the language, the values, some of the best orators and the most important cultural figures of the deaf, but also their economic empowerment. The value of the gifts and the fact that the money had been raised entirely from contributions by the deaf was an important part of this ceremony. It was the first large public ceremony planned by and for deaf Americans. Right. So it had to have been absolutely riveting. And since I know there were deaf Vermonters at that event, my suspicion is deaf Vermonters took that energy in 1850 home with them. In March of 1852, several Vermont newspapers covered a story of a convention of deaf mutes. About 30 deaf people gathered here in Montpelier in 1852. The Vermont Journal reported the deaf mutes of Vermont met in convention at the courthouse in Montpelier. The object of the meeting was raising funds to aid in the erection of a monument to the memory of the late Thomas Gallaudet. Turns out Thomas Brown had called for that grand reunion just in time. They gathered in September of 1850. Gallaudet dies in September of 1851, almost exactly a year later. So now deaf people are gathering across New England to try to raise money to erect a monument in his memory, including this group in Montpelier who comes together to start the work. But by January of 1853, bad news had reached Vermont from organizers of this effort in Connecticut. The fundraising was struggling. The reporting was this: the officers of the Gallaudet Monument Association in Hartford respectfully inform the deaf mutes in the state of Vermont that they have received large contributions from the mutes in several states, but these contributions have been insufficient to defray the expenses of the monument. It was hoped that more people would start contributing and soon, so this work would get done. Deaf Vermonters took that to heart and immediately organized a second convention here in Montpelier at the Brick Church this time in 1853. Organizers expressed their hope, quote, that there may be manifested a zeal on the part of deaf mutes of this state, which will awaken an interest in those of other states. Deaf community leaders from New Hampshire came in support of this effort, unsurprisingly. Thomas Brown is there, unsurprisingly. And George Lucas serves as the secretary for this meeting at the Brick Church in 1853. As secretary, Lucas placed notices about the convention in Vermont newspapers. Organizers assured readers that travel to attend this convention would be easy for them. As Lucas published, arrangements will be made with the presidents of several railroad companies in the state to grant the mutes a pass to the convention. Each one of the committee will act as a conductor on several railroad lines in the state. and will meet the mutes at the several depots and conduct them. Deaf and dumb ladies will be placed under the care of some elder deaf and dumb ladies, and they need not fear any danger. And women traveling alone, but it'll all be safe. And I'm reading this and quoting the exact usage. The usage of deaf and dumb in the 1850s, to be clear, simply meant at that time deaf and mute. Right, dumb did not have the connotation that we would apply to it now, and so it's also a matter of signaling deaf pride here at the time. Deaf people don't talk, right? Deaf people sign. Right, and we want people to know that, so we tell them that we are deaf and mute because that's who we are. Right, so the language is okay here. Thanks to the work of Betty Ann Morse, we know that one of the organizers here, Daniel Phelps, served as a conductor in this way on the Vermont Central Line, because she uncovered a letter that Daniel had sent to Marietta Tyler in Middlebury. He had written to her directly, asking her to attend the convention. And his note, like that deaf person to deaf person note, really gives us insight into the behind the scenes of it all. So he wrote to her saying, I have the pleasure of writing to inform you that a convention of deaf mutes is to be held at Montpelier on the 23rd and 24th of this month. I wish you would leave home through Burlington to Montpelier on the 22nd. You will have a free pass to Montpelier and back. I will be in Burlington and I will find you at the Hart Hotel or at the depot and take you on to Montpelier. So do come. As I was reading that letter, it suddenly dawned on me that dozens of little letters like this had to have gone out all over the state. From this organizing group, right, to all the deaf people to get them to come. But again, we as historians, it just looks like there's a convention and people just magically appear, right? This shows us how deaf people were active in their own cause, in communication with each other. They know how the trains run. He's being very specific about which one you get on. Also, trains, public transportation, sigh. How the world has changed, right? But here, we can see deaf people navigating all of these systems confidently, right? And just assuring one another, we have a plan, we can all do this, and we can come together. But so few of these kinds of handwritten notes survive that we as historians are sort of shut out, right, of how the deaf community was so active on its own behalf in the 19th century. So again, if anyone stumbles across any of these, let me know immediately. And this convention, again, was covered in the Vermont press because deaf people gathering in big numbers was still, sort of a rarity in the 19th century. And so newspaper reporters went, oh, what's that happening? And they would just write a public interest story. And so one covered the event, concluding that he hoped that there may be a larger attendance at the convention than there was here last year. Deaf people will have the pleasure of meeting all of their old schoolmates and friends. One newspaper also picked up on the dual purposes now of this meeting. I mean, technically, remember, we're meeting in order to urge people to give more money, to raise money for the monument, to raise in honor of Gallaudet. But one newspaper also hooked onto the other agenda item. The mutes gather also to see what means the convention will devise to establish an annual society for the improvement of their education. That annual society is going to turn out to be the New England Gallaudet Association. So here's where we see kind of seeping in. We started this for one set purpose. We're going to raise money to honor one of our own. But this other purpose will be the one that establishes the New England Gallaudet Association. And even that has gotten the press's attention. The deaf people are organizing for bigger things than even this monument raising. I should add also that the proceedings at the Brick Church for these events, these conventions, were entirely in American Sign Language. So if you're wondering how did that work, that's a great question for the hearing reporters. I have this from one hearing reporter. A large number of addresses were delivered, some of them interpreted by being read to the audience, to all of which a marked attention and general approval was given, as well by mutes as by those who could hear. Okay, so first of all, who are these hearing people who are also in attendance? I have absolutely no idea. This hearing reporter, obviously, but more hearing people? I don't know. Also, deaf community leading the way in the 1850s for access, for hearing people, right? We struggle to make sure that we have access for deaf people still in this day and age. If your deaf community goes, maybe a few people will show up. We'll have to make sure there's a hearing person who can read everything to them, because they should be included too, right? Deaf community, just better in every possible way. This is the event, this Montpelier moment, with a few random hearing people apparently in attendance. This is the moment that is crucial to the founding of the New England Gallaudet Association. This is the reason that they're remembering George Lucas as the central figure in their own institutional history, because this is the moment where he makes his move, and reporters start noticing it. It also means that all of the energy, enthusiasm, and new leadership coming out of the Montpelier Convention was critical to organizing the entire New England deaf community, and then in turn, I would argue the entire American national deaf community, because the NEGA is the first deaf organization in the country's history. And so that energy here on the ground in Montpelier was crucial to that, which means that I think that Vermont's deaf founding mothers and fathers are proving to be the founding mothers and fathers to the American deaf community as well. Thank you so much for coming out today. I so appreciate it. I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has any. Yeah.
I'm just really thrilled to be here today because my own researchers have covered some similar ground. I'm a Vermonter, and so some of the points that you made today are things that I came across in my own researches as well. So a lot of the points that you hit on, I can absolutely concur with. I was trying to find some information myself on George Lucas, and I found that he's from Bradford, Vermont.
Yes.
You didn't have that.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Bradford, and the Historical Society had no clue about a George Lucas who had lived there. Unfortunately, that turned out to be a dead end. But George himself also was a lawyer.
Huh.
And yes, he was a lawyer, and he wrote law, and he did a tremendous amount of advocacy work and really moved things along. So when you were mentioning, just envisioning those links, and thinking about some of the things that happened, for instance, on Martha's Vineyard, the historical, that concept of a deaf community leading the way in Martha's Vineyard and becoming a very important political community. I feel like George Lucas was part of a similar movement and a leader in a similar way, that it had impacts that really reverberated across the country. Because deaf people, as a result, in that era, often were better educated than their hearing peers. And I think that whole piece of history is just fascinating. Vermont is really rich in history. Another person that I just want to add to your list is a man named James Dennison.
Oh, yes. No, thank you. Yeah, his name.
Yes, and his father was a physician, Dennison, and so the historical house, they have a historical house, Dennison House, in South Royalton. And James, the physician's son, was, as I said, was deaf. And he was the first principal at the elementary school in DC on the Gallaudet campus.
Yeah,
So
that's
that's another Vermont link. And his sister married Gallaudet. So when I was a kid, I remember seeing older deaf people telling stories about Gallaudet and Montpelier and Gallaudet and Montpelier and the significance of that connection. And I remember this as I was a kid for years, hearing these stories from older folks, and I never had made that connection that there was a marriage there until I read more about that. So just very happy that you're here to help us make connections that show the significance of Vermont in the history of the deaf community.
thank you so much. I appreciate that a lot.
Yes, yeah, I think it's something that often deaf people know, but it's time to kind of show our light, not to hide it under a
Yes.
as they say,
No,
to let the broader community
Yes.
know what deaf people have accomplished.
I think that's an excellent point, and I think the realities of deaf history have been why the community has sort of, as you said, hidden its light, right? For so long, right? Or until this period that we're talking about in the 19th century is like this great period of coming together, discovering community, creating a whole a language, American Sign Language, right? And then building the community brick by brick, like creating organizations like the NEGA. And so it's just all upward trajectory from excitement, right? But then by the time we get to the early 20th century, now that entire community is under attack, right? Sign language is attacked. You have people trying to remove sign language from deaf education. You have the rise of what's known as the oralist movement. We're going to drive American Sign Language into extinction. Deaf people will turn into like little oversized hearing people and talk all the time. And they won't need deaf community anymore, so the community will also go extinct, right? So it's easy to understand, for me as a historian, right? Well, then this is how come deaf community just goes, right? These hearing people are not safe because they're not safe. Don't never trust deaf people. So we're going to go over here and protect ourselves and our community from you and your interference. Right. And that was completely understandable, 100% the right thing to do at the time, without question. But the reality is then, because of that really smart decision, now, as we're coming, I want to believe, out of that a little bit, it means that the stories that you're talking about, the deaf community was sharing in itself, we don't know that out here in hearing, meanwhile in hearing world, right? And the result of that lack of knowledge is that it's our own fault, right, as hearing community. But it still means that we haven't gotten to see the history the deaf community was making this entire time right in front of us. And so the stories that you're sharing and the information that Vermont deaf community is holding on to still today, yeah, we haven't had access to that because we haven't earned it, right? Frankly. And I'm just hopeful that now we're at a different kind of cultural moment, and the historical profession is at a different moment where there seems to be a lot more energy and enthusiasm for doing the kind of stuff I've been advocating for in my own work, where we actively seek to put members of the deaf community back into their own story and then retell their history from that center. So I appreciate your willingness to share those stories too. It matters a great deal.
Mhm.
Yes.
Sorry, did you just say that? So I've learned some of US deaf history. That part I knew. The Vermont part is new to me. So I am curious where you found some of the documents, the ASD documents, the letters about the trains. Where was all of that information kept?
Yeah, that's a great question. So much of the experience of doing this work is running around in circles to a lot of different archives and hoping you bump into something. I'm not gonna lie. The records of the American school are very good. And so the little tidbits, particularly like the story I got about Diana Miles and the child she had on the wedlock and how the school seems to know all about that. Um, that is in a book literally called A Record of Facts, as they from time to time come to the attention of the principal and officers of the American School for the Deaf. It's like this unwieldy knife. It's hilarious, right? And it's this huge, just volume, all handwritten. And so it literally is that somebody, the handwriting changes, people just add in, I heard the following about so and so, had it in the book. Right? They started keeping that in 1849 and goes for maybe 10 years. So it's sad to me that it stopped being kept up, but it works for me because like that's the sweet spot of the deaf historical people that I'm tracking. Then once you find a fact, you have to try to cross-check it against public facts to make sure the school is correct. And in this case, it wasn't that hard. Right, I find Diana Mills here in Vermont census records, and then, oh, look, there's a son. Oh, that gets me to find the birth certificate for the son. Oh, father not recorded, no name, right? So now I'm like, oh, okay, your story of the American school is looking better because it looks like you had it correct. So it helps to have external sources, but the real trick for me and why I keep looking to this earlier period in deaf history is the American school itself, like, is giving me places to start in its records. And having a little bit of a leg up, that's what lets me jump into census records with a little confidence, start reading newspapers around that time. Has anybody written about this? Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm Betty Ann.
Oh, Betty Ann, oh my God, it's oh, thank you so much for your work. Such a gift.
It was pattern that I've never experienced before. And just so folks know here kind of how I got my information in the house that I live in, which was abandoned. And I happened to manage to get in the attic and found there were 3 letters. And one was from George Lucas to Marietta, inviting her to the convention. And then there was one from the gentleman in Bradford, Vermont. And then there was another letter, which was a personal letter from a deaf woman in Middleburg to Marietta. And I can only believe that those letters were there in this abandoned house because Marietta had put them there, because the attic was dry and the rest of the house had no windows or doors, and they were just preserved so well.
Which is amazing. The story itself is amazing, but then the story you pull out of them is equally amazing. So thank you.
It's just amazing how many resources you can find.
Yeah.
If you really have the time to do it. And it took a good year.
Sure.
With the help of my friend Mary Ann.
And I am convinced that there are probably other families who are sitting on letters like that, who they don't know, like, what, why is this important? Like, they just held on to it because they're related to this person, but they're not. So like, oh, it's my great 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 uncle's letter about railroad trip. But most people don't really know a lot of deaf history, their background in it. So they're not thinking, oh, this is a piece in the puzzle of how 19th century deaf community formed, right? So I'm convinced that, again, I believe this. I remain convinced that if we keep looking in enough archival spaces, we put the word out to enough people, that letters like that will emerge. Everything you found was phenomenal, but I'm especially still moved by the personal letter, the one personal letter that survives between Mariana and it's Lucetta Wright, who's another deaf Vermonter. Because it is a personal letter. And I just want like 25 more where they're just writing to each other about life in Vermont and
I do have that.
other friends. That's phenomenal.
Did bring that
Oh
letter.
my God, so good.
I'm just trying to figure out where it should find its final resting place.
Those are really rare. Like I'll say I've worked with another letter collection, and if people were interested in just reading from a deaf woman's point of view, in the 19th century, there's a pretty substantial, like 15 to 20 letters, in Massachusetts at a historical society. That's Lydia Macumber. B-E-R. If you look up her name, it'll take you to Westport Historical Society, and they published a blog about these letters. And I bumped into it accidentally, and I thought, "What do you mean letters?" Right, from this young deaf woman in the 1830s, and it's right after she's graduated from the American school. She's back home. She misses all her deaf friends, and they have even better both halves of correspondence. Right, they have the letter she wrote, and they have replies from some of her friends. Oh my God, it's phenomenal. To be able to see that little window into their lives. But that's like probably the only one I can think of off the top of my head that's a relatively deep collection of letters from deaf community members in the 19th century. More of that, please. Yes, anyone who's sitting on those.
Just one other thing, the American School for the Deaf at
Yes.
that time, they kept documents listing each student
Yeah.
when they were there, what age they were there, why they were deaf, and then, a follow-up as to what they were doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I will add too, for folks who are interested in this kind of research, the American School for the Deaf's archives are pretty unusual that way. The American School is the first school for deaf people founded in the US, and so it's very aware, right, of its place in deaf education, and it keeps all of its records together really well. And that registration book that you're talking about, where every student gets a number, the first student to enroll, second student to enroll, and you just read them all in order. They give all this information, and they still continue that practice to the current end, which is so sweet. Like, incoming students are like, and you are student 2,630, except you can't deal with HIPAA, right? Yeah, in such a record, you can get into that archive. Like that actually is not like current. Yes, absolutely not. But as a 19th century historian, it works for me because I can have carte blanche to like poke into those records. It's great. And the school also kept track of if they get married later in life, if they knew they had that. So it starts out like as an admission tool, but then it turns into other.
And how they got the funding to go to this.
It's usually there too, yes, and that's an excellent point. Here, a lot of the deaf Vermonters we've been talking about were funded by the state of Vermont to attend the school. There's only like a handful who their parents paid the tuition. Most of them are state funded. Yes.
I'm curious about George Lucas
Mhm.
as a lawyer.
I did not know that, so I have not heard anything about that. That is news to me.
Was he doing Was he doing any kind of advocacy work on behalf of the,
But
I think he was doing documentation as a lawyer.
the stuff?
So, you know, how you became a lawyer at that point in time was different than currently. So he did have his licensure to be a lawyer. So the people in town who needed different kinds of endorsements or things, he could draw up the paperwork for them as a lawyer.
yes, thank you so much again for coming. I so appreciate it. And let's go see. Sorry, Zoom people. For us in person, let's go see some stuff.